Good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us in the first of a new series of webinars from APEM Group focusing on offshore wind in Australia. Shortly, I'll be handing over to Alistair Davidson, Managing Director, Marine Science and Development at APEM Group, who will be our chair for today's webinar on the use of LiDAR in offshore wind marine surveys.
Thank you. Thanks, Liam. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry about that. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Alistair Davidson. I'm Managing Director for Marine Science and Development at APEM Group. I'm lucky enough to have about 20 years experience in EIA and consenting of offshore renewables and wave and tidal projects and offshore wind. And it's a really warm welcome for me to this, which is the first of APEM Group's offshore wind seminar, or webinars rather. It's a series which we hope will stretch out over the coming months to cover a range of topics around the key environmental challenges that are facing Australian offshore wind developers. We've got quite an interesting agenda today, so if we could just jump to that slide. Just quick welcome introductions, which is me, and then we'll a very quick introduction to the APEM Group. I'm going to pass to Sean Sweeney to do the presentation of the panel, which will be the vast majority of the time, and then we'll have a wrap up. What's interesting is we want your views on this, and we'd like your questions. So there is an opportunity of asking questions through the web app. So please do. You'll see there's a Q&A button at the top of your screen. Just very quickly about APEM Group. There's lots of words on this slide, but essentially APEM Group is one of the largest environmental consultancies, purely environmental. We have 700 staff, 200 of which are dedicated to supporting offshore wind projects. That's through our marine wildlife surveys services, through our scientific advice services, and also through our EIA and consenting services. We've consented over 30 gigawatts of offshore wind projects throughout UK and Europe. And Australia is a key feature of APEM Group's future plans, and our Australia team is established and is rapidly growing. Really pleased to say that today we're going to be hearing from Sean Sweeney, who's APEM Group's global lead for ornithology and is one of the key risk areas for offshore wind development and the authorisation in Australia, which is the survey and gathering of accurate data to determine the impacts of offshore wind farms on seabird populations. I'm just going to pause now and introduce our esteemed panel. Really pleased to be joined by Andrew Coston. Andrew is offshore approvals manager for Corio Generation. Corio Generation recently and successfully secured the feasibility license for the Great Eastern Offshore Wind Project in Gippsland. Andrew brings 25 years of experience working in marine science and engineering across consultancies, government regulators, and as a developer for offshore wind projects. Andrew is joined by Angus Cook from the Biodiversity Consultancy. Angus is a well-known expert on the interaction between renewables and seabird populations. Prior to joining the Biodiversity Consultancy, Angus has 15 years as a research ecologist, looking at the interactions between wind farms and bird populations with the BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology. Absolutely delighted also to have Claire McCutcheon from Australian consultancy Biosis. Claire is a senior associate zoologist with 15 years experience in bird, mammal and habitat surveys and leading the impact assessments. Finally, our speaker, Sean Sweeney. Sean will speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll have a chance for some Q&A. So please use the Q&A function at the top of the screen. Sean is APEM's most experienced seabird ornithologist with extensive offshore wind project experience. Sean has almost 20 years experience across seabird surveys, the analysis of data, collision risk modelling, displacement modelling, and the assessment of population effects on seabirds from offshore wind and other major marine developers. Sean is based in our Melbourne office and is APEM's country manager for Australia. So with that, I will pass to Sean to start the presentation. Sean.
Thank you, Alistair. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everybody from wherever you have dialed in. It's a truly global event that I'm pleased to be part of it all. So yes, there was a further slide here following Alistair's kind introduction and introduction to the services and what the APEM Group have achieved over the many years that it's been operating. Within that is helping to secure approvals for over 50 gigawatts of offshore wind farm approvals globally, and with that comes through that is marine wildlife surveys of over 1,500 digital aerial surveys that have now been completed globally. And we have a huge, real diversity of our clients across the globe, from government agencies, other consultancies, developers, conservation bodies, and private contractors as well. And as Alistair iterated earlier, that comes from a sort of dedicated 200 resource staff across the globe, most of those based in Europe, with direct offshore wind farm experience. So if I could just go to the next slide, please. So I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where our staff, our offices are located, and where our projects take place here in Australia. And particularly the lands I'm fortunate to be working from here in South Bank, Melbourne, home to the Wurundjeri people. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as to Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders, on all of those. We recognise and celebrate their cultures, traditions and protocols. So, evolution of surveys, and just a little bit of a background really. Renewable energy projects, they've obviously developed and innovated and increased in performance in the offshore environment over many decades, from the very first array using 450 kilowatt wind turbine generators in Danish waters back in 1991, to multiple arrays across European waters utilising 3.2 megawatts, that's step up in wind turbine generators, to the most recent proposed arrays planning for up to 20 megawatt wind turbine generators, showing how far advances in science and technology have helped to drive improvements and cost efficiencies to the industry globally. And the APEM Group have been driving some of these innovations and improvements to the important early stages of the EIA process, that's the environmental impact assessment process, and that's to help define how best to collect data in the marine environment for seabirds and other marine mammals to characterise the baseline. APEM started collecting data using digital aerial methods over 15 years ago, after realising that this method did not suffer from biases associated with boat-based or aerial visual methods, and providing clients with an improved record from a health and safety perspective, and bringing cost efficiencies and reliability to the collection of baseline data through our survey provision. For those less familiar with how we came about developing digital aerial surveys and LiDAR systems for surveying seabirds, it's important to understand why different regions across the globe adapted, innovated and evolved through time. As during my own time at APEM over nearly 13 years, I've witnessed firsthand the shift from data being from boat-based to aerial visual, to aerial digital stills and videos, to the latest standards being set from the combined digital aerial and LiDAR survey methods. But when you consider boat-based, traditionally they were used across Europe and in other territories that they continue to be used, and because the vessels may have been more freely available to charter and readily available to get going straight away, with no additional technologies required other than staff and binoculars. However, the experience from Europe and other territories is worth noting, as issues including breaks in data collection due to poor weather, data being collected over multiple days, having gaps in that data collection and consistency, and also just certain offshore wind farm zones might be so large that a boat may have to actually be sent out and staying within the area for very long periods of time. And there's obviously a lack of a permanent record from the data that's collected, and it's very reliant upon observer skills and experience, which can be affected, particularly in new territories, if high demands from multiple projects all occur at the same time, and they can be coupled with limited resources of skilled surveyors available to undertake this very skilled survey method. However, away from that side of things, the biggest issues which were unbeknown to many people until people started collecting data using boats over 20 years ago was the actual behaviour of birds in response to large survey vessels in the first instance. Many species can be either attracted or repelled away from boats. They may potentially see it as a food source and so be attracted to it and come in to say hello. They may actually just not like the sight or sound of a vessel going through the ocean or the seas, and are well ahead of that vessel approaching the particular bird. They may fly away, so be undetected from the survey effort. So this causes a now well-known bias in the records for certain species, particularly in the northern hemisphere waters, which consequently were then recorded in either greater abundances for those birds that were attracted to the vessels, or in lesser abundances where they were repelled. And that obviously had a consequence on the predicted abundances and the densities that were then used to determine the baseline, which went through the impact assessment process. So therefore not collecting the natural occurrence of those abundances and densities of particular bird species in the marine environment. So as vessels and seabirds, as vessels affect seabirds, are not fully understood in Australian waters, it's really important that the abundances and densities in the flying behaviour are collected in a manner that is collected in an unbiased manner, which helps reduce the uncertainties that lie within the baseline data we're collecting. And another quite important point to understand is that for certain species, whilst they may aggregate on the sea surface together in sometimes larger numbers, sending a vessel through that particular flock of birds will instantly put them all up into the air, and sometimes well ahead of the vessel approaching that particular flock of birds. So therefore that increases the number of flying birds, increases the flying density of particular seabirds, and therefore increases the perceived risk from collision risk, and the impacts that might then be undertaken through the EIA process on those particular seabirds. So adding layer on layer in terms of additional unrequired or unneeded precaution into those assessments. So we'll briefly touch on the next one here. So if we hop from the visual boat-based meta surveys, there was a brief period where people were utilising visual aerial surveys, and there are still some territories that undertake such surveys for collecting seabird data. So these visual methods typically flew very high speeds at quite low flight heights above the sea surface, with aircraft flying around 75 meters above the sea surface, so almost akin to a sort of Red Bull race through those hoops that you see, which is it caused havoc to actual bird species on the sea surface, flushing many of them into a panic into the air. It also had quite a number of issues in relation to the reliance of the data being collected. Surveyors had to be extremely skilled in very, very quick bird identification using binoculars while still holding on to the aircraft and then trying to talk into a dictaphone of what they may have seen or may not have seen in terms of numbers and abundances and diversity of the species. So as a method for long-term monitoring and with respect to health and safety, it clearly failed over time with a short period of time that people, organisations collected data in a method, and it wouldn't be safe to fly an aircraft at 75 metres, having that sort of before and after effect to try and look post-construction monitoring. No one in right mind would want to fly an aircraft 75 metres above the sea surface between wind turbines. So, and the very fact that you are flying at such speed and flushing so many birds into the air, it also would provide a potential fatal increase in collisions from the seabirds flushed into the air that may move into the turbine spaces in the rotor swept area and collide with the turbines. So naturally, people started testing digital aerial methods as the technology improved in terms of the camera systems that were available, moving from originally what was 3 centimeters, so 3 centimeter data collection on the sea surface was 1 pixel in a camera system in the actual imagery, up to what APEM now uses as sort of our global standard of 1.5 centimeter, which is 1.5 centimeters on the sea surface is actually 1 pixel in your image, which means you're able to identify even the small species and the smaller features on some of those bird species from the data we collect. So the widespread use of digital aerial methods, both stills and videos, has been the sort of go-to choice for developers in European and US waters, which have allowed that increase in confidence in the baseline characterization to allow for the referral process and the approvals for offshore wind farms in those territories. These data collection methods allowed for quality assurances to also be brought in, so people could retrospectively review the data that were collected and agree on the species that were there, and all the other, and that sort of permanent record in terms of the data that was held and is still held by us, sometimes in relation to data we collected 15 years ago. So there's also been an increase in health and safety. We don't have so many people out on a vessel for days on end like the boat surveys used to do. So we have aircraft which are much higher, very highly maintained health and safety restrictions, and in terms of the protocols that they have to go through in the risk assessments that take place, and just the safety of aircraft in terms of the provisions of how you have to able to take aircraft into the air and the hoops you have to go through to do that. One of the key things from a digital aerial perspective is that it's also able to be consistently carried out throughout any stage of the project life cycle. So that's through the pre-construction phase, determining the baseline for your EIA. That's through the construction phase if you're monitoring for sensitive species to construction activities. That's through the operational phase, as well as the decommissioning periods. So digital aerial methods collect data without disturbing birds, and because they can fly at heights of well over 400 meters above sea level, they're able to also mobilize quickly. They're able to collect data in shorter periods of time. They're able to stay away from the risk areas and fly way above the rotor swept area as well. And they typically collect data over a single day, as well as having that permanent record of the data, which can be subjected to external quality assurance that I mentioned just previously. So digital aerial surveys are also the most accurate method to collect data on seabirds' natural distribution and abundance on a monthly, seasonal, annual, as well as interannual basis, and provide that robust baseline to inform impact assessments. However, it should be noted that recent independent peer-reviewed papers all agree and put forward recently that digital aerial surveys shouldn't be used or relied upon for determining flight heights for particular seabird species or for all seabird species, as all digital aerial survey methods have a large unknown degree of error in the flight height estimates. And this is why APEM listen to the science. We reviewed this on a number of years, and there's nothing that can be done in terms of that natural variation in a bird size. So you and I'm looking here at 73 people within the webinar. You and I are all going to be different heights. We're all going to be different shapes and sizes. And that natural variation in any species, just like Darwinism, means that you can't rely on a measurement which is normally used for, even it's a range-based estimate, that size-based estimate, it relies on one size going through. So if we're all different sizes, then that one key factor, you can fix anything else, you can really all your uncertainties and refinements on any other part of the process, but that little bit of uncertainty around natural size is always going to create greater error margins, and which then cause issues when further down the line. So that's why the APEM invested heavily in internally for our latest LiDAR and combined DAS, digital aerial survey or DAS, with LiDAR technologies to provide a cost-effective solution for all data needed to complete an EIA. So that there's one service provider, there's one cost, there's no hidden extras, there's no need to go out and collect other survey data. We go and collect those data, and that's there for you for your baseline. So this now represents what we call the fourth stage of the marine wildlife data collection as a global best practice and a gold standard, routinely now used within the UK, in the US, and now in Australia for our clients. So we can just go to the next slide, please. This brings us naturally into sort of the importance of digital aerial surveys. So some of that you will have picked up from the latter part of running through the final slide there, slide 7. But one of the other things we need to realise is that knowing which species are present, so which seabirds are present, where they reside within your project site, during which times of year they naturally occur, and this is all very, very important in the EIA process, and this is why digital aerial survey is the preferred method to provide the answers to those key questions. It's also why we've made particular investments in continually improving and refining the process and the data collection methods that the APEM Group deploy across the globe, which differs in different territories. It's why we've added and included the latest global navigation satellite systems, inertial measurement units, and externally mounted global positioning satellite antennas. And these core components allow us to record the in-flight altitude as well as the aircraft movement, resulting in more accurate geospatial data being collected and allowing us to offset the natural or the movements, the pitch, the roll, the yaw of the aircraft, which are essential for estimating effort capture and the coverage, especially important to provide robust population estimates, because we can account for any movement in the aircraft and the camera systems, and when we can identify the exact coverage, which is important to give those robust estimates. So it's our experience that when developing custom-made survey designs from over 15 years of experience, that we need to find those requirements for each project, and that we need to recognize that in new territories, there's potential that we also need to consider alternate approaches as well. That's why in data poor regions, such as the waters around Australia, despite the issues associated with some of the boat-based data collection I'd highlighted earlier, it's agreed that due to the large diversity, over 50 species and subspecies on top of that in Australian waters, some of which look very, very similar, even when seen at close range, there's still a place for such data collection and multiple data collection methods in the short to medium term to supplement the baseline with more refined identification, to split some species, to provide that further refined identification for difficult to split species and subspecies groups. So these data can then be used to help apportion out, so the data from the boats can be used to help apportion out some of those bird species that are identified to group level or split to subspecies levels, such as when we're trying to refine the sort of shy type albatrosses, which can be very, very difficult. And having seen and watched a few going around Cape Schanck yesterday on our bank holiday here in Victoria. And for anyone who's interested, actually, just that those in terms of us now being able to collect our data from 1.5 centimeter GSD, that allows us to get these beautiful and capture these beautiful images as we have on our survey efforts or returning from our survey efforts here across the waters in Australia. So we've got kelp gull there on the top left. We have Australian shelduck. We also have a great crested tern in the bottom right, and some lovely Australian pelicans there in the imagery. So if we could just go to the next slide. Listen, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the data collection methods, and to just provide you with this, I suppose, a small snippet of our lessons learned from operating at different scales across the globe, from those 1,500 surveys that we've delivered for our clients, it's important to sort of recognise why you are collecting data and the purpose for which you're collecting that data, and perhaps, you know, designing that project to collect the data and how we want to use those data into the future. And that's why there are differences for how we would advocate survey design, whether that's the transect or the grid-based design. So as you can see there, that from a transect design, that upper image there, then you'd collect images in a button imagery with our digital stills method in a continuous line across the site, and they're more widely spaced going across the site. Now, when you use a grid-based design, then you can see that there's a much more even spread of the sampling. So we're collecting data on more regular points, and we get a more thorough data collection across the actual survey area. And these are really important points to recognise, particularly in areas where there's uncertainty or a lack of data. And we'd always advocate that the transect data collection methods are suitable for the sort of wider regional spatial scales, as they're able to provide cost-effective data collection over huge areas, like we've done off the state of New York and the Carolinas, off the west coast of Ireland, as well as working with government bodies across the east coast of Scotland as well, as just a few examples. But the drawback is that these data don't typically reach the levels of precision needed in their population estimates, so they're not quite as suitable for site-specific EIAs, and sometimes they can be required to be doing further modelling or additional effort that is on top of that in terms of before they're used for EIA purposes. Therefore, we'd always advocate, particularly for the grid-based data collection survey method, particularly when we're looking at proposed offshore wind farm sites and appropriate buffers surrounding them. This is the method we deployed for the Star of the South, and for our work for the Greater Eastern project for Corio, as it follows the most basic but more importantly very important scientific principles, wishing to collect data to calculate robust population estimates. So this method collects data following that more even sampling regime to provide that greater precision. And it's really important, really, from an approvals perspective, when reviewing risk levels and mortality rates attributed to different species through the IA process. It also provides confidence in the data remaining fit for purpose and retaining the same coverage levels, even in cases where project sizes and shapes change over time, because we are collecting and we have the sampling spread across the same area, which means that there's not any additional survey effort that would be required. There's no hidden costs that would be sprung up to our clients for extra modelling that might be needed if you then reduced over time in terms of the coverage you're expected. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So now we come, I suppose, to the more important and the most important slides of this presentation, what maybe many of you dialed into. So thanks again for joining us wherever you are in the world. So APEM were the first to develop and refine the, sorry, if I suppose take a step back before LiDAR and the use of LiDAR. So it's important to understand that APEM were the first to develop and refine the size-based methodology, which comes from the standard digital aerial survey methods, which was used previously to estimate seabird flight heights. And we went into great depth to invest in all the kits that I'd outlined earlier in terms of the global positioning, the internal inertial effort, the IMU, in terms of refining and reducing the confidence intervals around all of those individual components that go into the calculation for a size-based seabird flight height. However, we still got caught up by the uncertainty around the actual size of an individual bird, which, as I mentioned earlier, varies dramatically from different populations of the same species across the world or across your survey area, and just different times and sizes and natural variation. So in line with a number of recent independent peer-reviewed papers and UK statutory nature conservation body advice, due to that natural size variation in each individual bird, it's not possible to provide accurate flight heights from digital aerial stills or video methods without high degrees of uncertainty needing to be captured in those data, which means that there's wide confidence intervals that need to be applied to seabird flight heights, skewing these data sets, which in turn undermines confidence in collision risk modelling impacts. So as an EIA practitioner, this was a real concern for us and for the industry, and so we reacted very proactively, rather, to look at how we could provide that solution. It's why the APEM Group developed our LiDAR system for use with digital aerial surveys, which we developed through funding with developers who are like-minded developers who wanted to help solve these problems, and put forward a solution that could be brought forward, a simplistic solution that could be taken forward in any territory across the world. And so we carried out a number of monitoring projects across operational offshore wind farms, as well as control areas for both developers and as well as UK government agencies. And this resulted in our new essentially a combined digital aerial survey with LiDAR system that's now operating here in Australian waters. And really, it's raised the bar for marine wildlife survey, and it's taken us to that fourth layer in terms of that fourth level of data collection in the marine environment, again, to sort of help provide confidence to the regulators in the data that's being collected, greater confidence in the impacts that have been predicted, and also just reducing that uncertainty and the wariness around that from key stakeholders, and the buy-in for what we're doing here is actually going to be respected, and it's going to be understood, and it's going to be acknowledged. And it allows for both species and species group flight heights to be considered and provided to our clients. In there, sorry, if you're just for those who are just staring at pictures, you might want to just know where these ones are from. These again are from the Great Gippsland area that we collected outside of our survey projects, and we got there a couple of images of an adult and a juvenile Australasian gannet. We also have a shy type albatross there, as well as at the bottom there's a pied oyster catcher in flight going over an intertidal area, and some penguins, and believe it or not, they're not flying. Obviously penguins don't fly, they look like they're flying, but they're actually swimming through the water, so a bit of fun there. But yeah, always nice to see the penguins in these images. So we just go to the next slide, please. Brilliant. So how does LiDAR work? So there's a reason that we took on and we're confident in the way that we use LiDAR. It's a tried and tested and accurate method to map terrestrial assets such as trees and the topography of areas, and has been used by engineers for construction projects for many decades. It essentially fires a series of pulses out of the laser system, out of the LiDAR system that's hosted in the aircraft from the underside of the aircraft, and they travel down to either the earth or the sea surface and then reflect back up to the sensor in the LiDAR system. As you can see, very easily demonstrated there on the left-hand side of the slide. So once the pulse hits an object, so in this case on the left-hand side of the slide there you can see a bird above the sea surface, it reflects back to the sensor. And the difference in the return timings allows an accurate picture to be created where any seabirds in relation to this water surface can be measured precisely. And this accuracy is within 5 centimeters accuracy. So despite the camera kit being over 400 meters above the sea surface, we can get a measurement within 5 centimeters of where that bird is in time and space in relation to the sea surface. So these data can also be used to make 3D representations, which we've done for certain clients, where you can then visualize where the birds are in a 3D model in relation to where the turbines may be or maybe being placed into the future. And that's really important. And they can also be used in terms of control areas, so we can collect data to see the differences in behavior, perhaps from birds flying in an area where there are no turbines to birds that are flying where turbines are operational. And again, this has been used and undertaken and published in some of the papers that we've worked with for government agencies in the UK and wider. Just go to the next slide, please. Sorry, you did just get a little vision of the Australasian gannet flying through, and then some of the point returns there that we get from our typical LiDAR data collection. I'll only touch briefly here on one of our case study projects here. I think most people know of the Star of the South. Many people seem to have worked on it, including the APEM Group. We worked very hard ahead of arriving here to do that work. So the preparations that were involved from the whole team, from the Marine Wildlife Survey in the UK, from about 2018 to prepare to arrive here in very testing circumstances. Actually, for anyone who lived in Victoria and Melbourne in the year 2000, it's hard to forget COVID and the global pandemic that hit everybody here. So to be able to set up in that environment, the challenges that we had as a team, as individuals, to go through those lockdowns is really sort of to be commended, really. And it showed that sort of effort and the commitment and the ability for us to continue to collect data continually throughout issues, including global pandemic, and testament to what the team can do, and those individuals who particularly the sacrifices they made in terms of being able to having a quarantine, in terms of long periods of time that they had to spend isolated in hotels on the airfield to get that program of surveys through, particularly that first 18 months during the COVID hit period. So it's sort of recognised now that project took forward. It really gave a leap forward in sort of data collection of best practice, combining digital aerial survey and LiDAR data collection in its second year of data collection. But it also utilised an importance to recognise. It also utilised that boat-based data, which was used to refine some of the identification in the apportionment through an apportionment process that fed into the baseline that was used and utilised for the collision risk model in that project. And this has since been taken forward into other projects, such as Korea's Greater Eastern Offshore Wind Farm, where we've been collecting data for around a year and a half now, and is proposed for other projects which we're yet to start, but we look forward to getting out over the water collecting data. So we hope this will ensure Australia makes the best start really to its energy transition and does not suffer from the issues of other territories, particularly in Europe and the US and other emerging markets, because you're going out and you're collecting data in the best way possible. Okay, and down to the next slide, please. My final slide, and then I will move on. So some of you may be tired of my voice, others might not be. Maybe it's a novelty. It's not worn off yet. But the final slide here really provides you with a summary of why digital aerial survey, or why our digital aerial survey with LiDAR will help reduce that uncertainty in future decision making, as well as increasing the confidence in the impacts that have been predicted by providing data which has more refined confidence limits intervals in the end product. So providing robust data to identify which seabird species and species groups utilize the seas in Australasian waters, as well as their natural abundance, seasonal usage and behavior, will form the bedrock of determining baseline conditions, and these data will be an essential component of a proportionate impact assessment process as part of the project specific development referrals and approvals into the future. It'll also help to refine the collision risk modelling process, which is a critical component of many seabird species assessments to determine how many birds may fatally collide with wind turbine generators, and establishing the risk from this potential impact is the most critical component of most developers' EIAs and referral processes, and therefore the more precise the impact can be determined will allow for the shedding of needless precaution applied to other data sources, particularly those relying on flight heights estimated using digital aerial survey only methods, which require consideration of much wider precautionary impacts. And this is a really important point, really, as when having to account for wider confidence intervals associated with flight heights means having to account for higher impacts from collision risk and greater uncertainty in the estimated risk to different seabird species. And that's particularly very important when you think of the wealth of seabird species here in Australasian waters, and the effort that goes into the EIA process. So with high levels of scrutiny from government and state level regulators, as well as from conservation bodies, other consultancies and the public, robust scientific data is key to providing confidence in these predictions. Therefore, impacts predicted from collision risk using LiDAR data can be accurately understood, and less precaution needs to be built into the input parameters for collision risk modelling, as these data are more precise, and the overall outputs from collision risk modelling have tighter confidence intervals, reducing those uncertainties. So when considering potential impacts from different offshore wind farm projects on seabirds, high degrees of confidence ensure that the correct level of precaution is included in the impact assessment process. So this in turn allows for a more efficient referrals and approvals process to be achieved, with more robust, accurate risk analysis being afforded from the beginning, when using APEM Group's digital aerial services, provided combined with LiDAR for offshore wind farm can be undertaken. So this one simple tweak in data collection methods in Australasian waters provides offshore wind developers and government regulators with the confidence that financial, environmental and delivery risk can be successfully mitigated first time, every time, and on budget and on time, as impact levels can be agreed, we believe, from the onset. So that determines the end of my slides. If I can pass back to Alistair.
Thank you, Sean.
And hopefully we can have other people talking. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Sean. Very informative, very useful. Canter through all of that. If we could we put the other panel members up on the screen as well, please? Is that possible? Thank you, Andrew. Hi, Angus, Claire. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Well, this takes us to the panel discussion side of the section of the webinar. So there is a Q&A button at the top of your screens. If you want to, if Sean has inspired questions, then please do ask them, and we will be looking at them as we come through. And I'll try and bring them in. But speaking as a marine biologist, I'm always looking down at the sea or the seashore, and you guys are always looking up in the air. So help me understand why we can't just rely on boat-based data. And I guess can I go to Angus for that, just to start off with your level of expertise?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Alistair. I think there's a couple of issues with the boat-based data. So Sean touched on it initially in relation to the sort of potential for the birds to be attracted or displaced by the boats. So you've got this sort of behavioural response to the boats. And one of the consequences of that is that when you're recording species flight heights from boat-based surveys, it's harder to be confident that you're recording their sort of natural flight behavior rather than some sort of response to the boat. So whether that be you're more likely to be recording a species like a diver or a loon as it's been flushed from the water's surface, or you're more likely to be recording a species like a gull that's been attracted to the boat because it thinks it's a fishing vessel and it might be responding to in that way, thinking it's an opportunity. So you're not necessarily capturing the true behavior of the bird. You might be more likely to be capturing the response of the birds to the survey vessel.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sean, Claire, any other comments on that one?
Yeah, happy to take it.
Oh,
sorry, go on, Claire.
yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was just reaching for the unmute button there. Yeah, I guess just adding, so Angus has spoken about flight heights and those behavioural responses and the biases associated with boat-based surveys, but also in terms of determining like density of birds and like an activity rate, which is a really important component into collision risk modelling. So I just wanted to, just add that that's another important aspect that that I guess the digital aerial survey provides that benefit in terms of it's a replicable method that gets that activity rate without those behavioural responses biasing the results.
Brilliant. Okay. One of the things I'm really conscious of is that we have developed digital aerial surveys in Europe where superpopulations have been really well studied, and we've got a reasonable sort of baseline. I guess it's a question for Angus actually is around sort of the use of DAS and LiDAR. Why is DAS and LiDAR important for areas which are perhaps less studied? And I'm just thinking of your experience, Angus, with looking at the development of offshore wind in other countries.
I mean, I think one of the big advantages of it is that it gives you an opportunity to build up a really good baseline data set that would hopefully be sort of widely available for lots of people to use fairly quickly. So you've got a good understanding of how many birds are out there and the types of heights that they're likely to be flying at, and that would then give you a really good understanding of which species are likely to present the greatest risk in terms of potential collisions and stuff like that. So I think it's just the ability to collect a really big data set relatively quickly, I think, is one of the sort of key advantages.
Fantastic. Any other comments on that? Okay. I'm really just sort of, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? That it's what we're seeing in Australia is a continuation of the use of boat-based data when we've got DAS and LiDAR being collected. I think this is something which is a little bit of a point of difference to Europe. And I just wonder, Claire, can you just sort of help us understand the kind of balance between the different survey techniques and how they can be used in concert?
Sure. Yeah. And it's a really important point because as Sean touched on, we're dealing with a very different marine environment and different suite of species here. We've got waters that support up to 70 species. That's what's been recorded for some of the surveys that have been done off the continental shelf edge. And many of our seabirds are very difficult to differentiate, even on boat-based surveys. But many of them actually require looking at views of their flanks or their underwing or even their bill coloration. And that means that for many species, we can't get to the species level of identification with digital aerial survey because of that dorsal view that we get from it. And so that's where boat-based surveys have been really important and will continue to be with an apportioning approach, which Sean also touched on. And that's something that we've been working on too, where we compare boat-based surveys. They don't need to be done at the same time, but in terms of having boat-based surveys that run concurrently during the same seasons or months, where we're getting species level of identifications from boat-based surveys that are then used to apportion the group level identifications that we get from digital aerial survey. So that it's a really important feature for undertaking surveys to inform the industry in Australia. And I know we're in a fortunate position where we can learn a lot from what's happened in the evolution of surveys in the UK. But I think it's still important to point out that it is a mix of surveys at the moment to sort of really give us the best level of certainty and confidence.
Just want to follow up on that. Do you see that as an evolving position, so that we would, as we get better at being able to identify species from aerial surveys, that we may be able to phase out some of the boat surveys, or vice versa?
I think it's probably too early to say at this point, because we still require site level information to inform collision risk modelling. So that's where we take in the site activity rate, flight density, and the component of species as well. And I think at the moment, it's all of these methods are sort of working together really well to cross-validate and complement each other, and also to give that confidence. And I think we'll have to sort of see what happens with time, and whether we start to see consistent patterns, and whether we can look at sort of regional or collaborative approaches to gather that information that can be then utilised.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. Sean, Angus, anything else to add to that?
Not particularly to add to that. I was just going to go back to just give a little further analysis or answer to the first question, actually, in terms of just that how we've evolved, and one of the issues actually that came across many different countries in Europe as a consequence of collecting data and using boats, which was in relation to species that were actually were sensitive to vessels being in the water, and therefore flew away before they were captured in the survey data records. And these are particular species are things like red-throated diver or red-throated loons and common scoter. And these species are typically found across the sort of southern North Sea, and also across into the central Irish Sea, just across North Wales into the northwest of England as well. And what had actually happened is that a lot of data had been collected using boats for many years ahead of and going into the baseline data for projects in those areas, and they hadn't detected the scale of those particular species that were occurring in those waters, and projects gained their approvals and were then built. And it was only until they started collecting data once they were operational, and they realized that using the digital aerial methods, that they found thousands and thousands of red-throated divers and thousands of common scoters in these areas, but then just outside or a number of kilometers away from the operational wind farms. And the reason why that's a concern, and why you wouldn't want to go down that route in Australia if you can help it, and why that diversity and the collecting data with the digital aerial, the LiDAR and the boat is very important initially here, is that the consequence of collecting data in that manner meant that some of those early projects have now taken the bulk of the cumulative effect, so that threshold for the impact that that species at that population level can withstand from operational wind farms in terms of the impacts has now been perceived to have been reached and tipped. That tipping point has been taken, and some of these projects have taken 90% of that headroom, leaving only 10% left. And now we're in a position where, all projects in the southern North Sea, for instance, no matter what their impact, even if it's the mortality of only half a bird or one bird, they'll still have to mitigate and spend a lot of money and time, effort into trying to avoid and mitigate for that particular instance of an impact. So it's really important, particularly from a developer's perspective, to understand the importance of getting that data right from the first, from the go, and learning from those lessons and the mistakes that have been made from Europe and other areas and other territories, so you can get things right here and allow yourself a smoother consent and a smoother referrals and approvals process that's more efficient and cost effective.
We're getting some. Thanks, Sean. That's really useful. We're getting some really interesting questions coming in from the audience. I'm keen to bring Andrew in. So I think I'm really keen to hear the kind of the developer's view on this, in terms of your view, Andrew, around the collection of both digital aerial survey and the use of LiDAR, and just to get that view. There's just to temper that. It's a really interesting question from Derek White, sort of fairly early on in the QA, around getting the balance right of scientific rigor and cost. And I think I'd really value your kind of developer's view on that.
Yeah, sure. Look, I won't go over what Sean's nicely summarised, because he has put it quite well around, I guess, the technical reasons. But what's coming through today is well, the flavour or the key word for the day is definitely certainty and or uncertainty. And ultimately, as a developer, and if I put my ex-regulator hat on, what I would like if I was the regulator, and what I'm endeavouring to do through this baseline program and our impact assessment is to provide the regulator with sufficient data to undertake an informed assessment of our proposal or of a proposal. So the key to that informed assessment is that the data is available and they have confidence as a regulator in that data. And if we can't provide fit for purpose data, well, then there's the potentiality that conditions will be highly conservative. And look, it's even possible if conditions are overly conservative that they may curtail operation or potentially even impact on FID. So it is important, and I think Sean or maybe Angus hit on this, is that we need to get it right first time, because the level of data and the costs that we're encumbering on this they are substantial, and what we're looking to not do is go back and have to collect more data. So there's been a lot of rigor in planning what we're undertaking, with the idea that it will be fit for purpose. And as Claire has hinted on, there is still the importance of the weight of evidence approach, where we're combining our data sets to look at a range of issues relating to seabirds that don't just necessarily focus on flight heights. And that's where things like the tagging work or the boat-based surveys are also, and population monitoring are also critically important. So it is really looking at it from a whole of, I guess, taking that perspective, the whole of project approach. So thanks. Yep.
I think that's really interesting. I think and that sort of chimes with some of the questions coming in from the floor here around data sharing, regional approach. And if you'll allow a sort of a hard-bitten observation, is when we were developing offshore wind in Europe, we started with a very small number of very small turbines in a very big sea. And essentially the biggest difference that we see with the Australian situation is you're putting in really big projects really close together all at the same time. So I'd be interested in your views around the kind of the challenge that presents for cumulative impact assessment, and for your views on data sharing between developers. And I know it's an evolving question, but Andrew, do you maybe want to give a view to start off with on this from the developer's perspective, and then maybe Sean, Angus, and Claire could comment on the science side of it?
Well, I think it is. Thank you, Angus. Alex. It's a key issue. It's a critical issue, in that we're not only having to look at location-specific impacts, but potentially regional impacts on populations, for example, and cumulative impacts. We're certainly more than open to discussing how and want to fully understand what that regional and cumulative impact assessment process will actually entail. And as yet, there's probably more work to be done and more information to come from the regulator around that, I guess that approach or those approaches. But the work that we are undertaking, I can say, is more than adaptable to consider regional impacts for other developers, etc. And I'd suggest that developers themselves will be looking to understand how we can work together going forward in a as collaborative as possible approach. So, and I know that Q are working in the background with Environment Information Australia, and going forward, there will be I guess a database or a series of databases that get built up over time that incorporate some of the data from the impact assessment processes that are undertaken for offshore wind developments. But yes, it's a massive drain on suitable and available resources, and that's one of the key risks, I guess, is having enough good people out there to do the work in an effective, cost-effective, and efficient manner.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. Sean, Angus, Claire, anything to add?
Just a quick one from myself, and for anyone listening who doesn't understand what Q is, that's the DQ we call it here. This is the Department of Climate Change, Energy and Environment and Water.
Sorry.
Just to clarify. But yeah, I think from our perspective, I suppose it's always that apples for apples, isn't it? You need to be able to compare things properly, and being able to provide and collect data in one manner. If you're collecting it from a site-specific basis for your particular offshore wind farm in Gippsland, be that in the Hunter region, in WA, wherever you may be around in Australia, it's about having that regional perspective, being able to put your site in the context of a regional context, and so being able to collect data, as one of our slides earlier suggested, just even if it's a slightly different method, but it's still collecting digital aerial data in terms of getting those regional, wider transect data collection, then that's really going to be of use to understand, are the 1,000 whatever species you might have, the short-tailed shearwaters, are those 1,000 that you've got in your project area, is that a significant number? Or if you have 10,000, is that a significant number? And being able to put that in context, you're not going to know that until you have regional data collection that's widely shared and available for other people to understand. And if you have 10 million of that particular species and you've only got 1,000, then that's the context you need. That it's not a significant area for foraging, for loafing, for resting, for molting, for instance. Whereas if you have the entire population within your project area, then you're going to have to have a think about this from an approvals perspective in terms of mitigating against that, or maybe you're in the wrong area.
Okay. We've had lots of questions, and that's a really nice answer, Sean. I'm gonna sneak one very quick last one. We've had some really interesting technical questions in from people like Jenna Huckensweger. One of the really interesting ones there is this combination of what's the ideal combination of boat-based LiDAR DAS. Angus, can you give us 30 seconds on that? Is that possible?
I think there's 30 seconds is going to be a bit of a challenge, but yeah, I think there isn't. I think we need to get away from this idea that there's an absolutely perfect data collection methodology. I think there's lots of different data collection methodologies out there, and they've all got their strengths and the weaknesses. We've heard the LiDAR can provide really, really good, precise flight height estimates, but particularly for some of the Australian seabirds, the species ID might not be quite what we need because of this issue of looking at the bird from above, when some of the identifiable features might be on the underside of the bird or on the beak and stuff like that. So I think the LiDAR will give really, really good flight height data, but there's still going to be this need for complementary boat surveys and things like that to provide the sort of resolution around species ID that you really need to sort of get a proper handle on some of these issues.
Brilliant. Angus, thank you very much indeed. I think it's time I wrapped up. I've got about 2 minutes left, so could we have the next slide, please? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just a massive vote of thanks to Sean for his presentation, but also to Andrew, Angus and Claire for being part of our panel. I really hope you found that a useful and stimulating discussion. To my mind, the kind of, to sum it up, I think there is the LiDAR, the use of DAS, I think are really interesting, really well established techniques now for measuring rather than estimating, which I think always helps. But I think the discussion really demonstrates the need to get that platform approach of multiple sources of data to get the level of certainty which is required for an industry which is moving very, very fast. So coming soon, there are more webinars coming towards us, looking at cumulative impacts, the point we just touched on, marine mammals, shipping and navigation, all focused around offshore wind development in Australia. Just thank you very much indeed for attending, and I really hope we can see you soon again. Is there a last slide? Thank you very much indeed. Brilliant. I will close it there on time. My thanks to our panel members and my thanks to you for joining. Have a good day.
Thanks, Alistair. Cheers,
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.